We've got Caleb, pronouns he, him, calling in from overarching hysteria. What? Or Ohio. He's calling from Ohio. What is the complexity of the universe argument for or against God? I've got some things to say about this. Caleb, you are on the Atheist Experience. How are you doing today?
Good.
All right. Sweet. So, right on. So, I've read the question that I have here on the call screen, but I'm wondering if there's more to what you're saying. Like, do you want to have expound on a little bit, or do you think that's good enough? Just, is the complexity of the universe for or against God?
Well, it's more of a question to you guys. Like, what do you think?
Jim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, just speaking as a software engineer, not a mechanical or double E, but complexity is not a sign of good design at the very least. Things need to be as simple as possible and as simpler. Complexity leads to catastrophic cascading failures, which are never very good. And the more complex a system, the worse that cascade failure can be. So simplicity is actually what we're looking at. And so when we look at biology, we don't see simplicity, we see complexity, which tends to mean that a system is growing organically. And I see this in my profession with some of the Fortune 500 companies that I work with who have very complex systems, because those systems have grown up organically as the business needed them, and nobody has gone in and done an overhaul to go and say, what do we really need to do here, and try to make it simpler. And that's not an easy thing to do. You can make the case that this was tried at Twitter, now X. I don't care what Musk wants to call it, it's still Twitter. And see the failures that he's had there in trying to do that, because he just started ripping stuff out. He had no care about keeping systems alive and knowing what systems did. He just started firing people and doing it that way, and that's not a good way to do it either. But as a general rule, you only get complexity when things grow organically and without a design. And so if you're going to claim there's a designer, you need to show the design. And you really, I don't see a way to see that design in there, because everything is more complex than it needs to be.
Yeah, I would build off of that a little bit. I want to hear what you have to say to what Jim said first. So before I start rambling on, Caleb, what do you think about all that?
Well, I mean, I'm a theist. I'm a Christian specifically. So, I mean, I think it goes along with what you were saying. I know your name, but I don't remember the other guy's name who was just talking. But
I'm
anyway, doesn't that go against the second law of thermodynamics, which states that things go to disorder?
No,
not really.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't, because the second law of thermodynamics, if you apply it to the entire universe, we don't know if it actually applies to the entire universe, because we don't know if it's an isolated system or not. And so everybody who quotes the second law of thermodynamics always forgets the last part, which is the most important part, and that is in an isolated system. And even then, it doesn't apply necessarily to the entire, or it applies to the entire system as a whole, but not necessarily to pieces within it. So you can have, because it's not homogeneous, it's trying to get to that homogeneity. But there are places where you can have very high energy and other places that have lower energy within the system, with all of it moving towards that direction. So there's just no way that any of it violates the second law of thermodynamics. Especially if you understand the second law.
Yeah, I would also just point out there, things like the second law, it talks about an increase in entropy, an increase of the probability of disorder and things like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that things will always become chaotic. It just means that, say, for example, one of the better demonstrations I've seen of it is a sandcastle. There are, a million different ways in which those individual grains of sand could be arranged to form a sand castle. But there's a lot more ways that those individual grains of sand could be arranged to make a pile of sand. And so, to say the pile of sand is a higher entropy thing, that the castle is going to tend towards the pile. Yeah, that makes sense. But when we look at things like galaxies, planets, life, these are things that actually follow really, really basic fundamental laws of physics and chemistry. And so, like, you know, as amazing as a planet or a galaxy is, that's just how gravity works, and it's gonna do something like that. It's like if you know all the parts of it, it kind of stands to reason that that's how they end up. Life seems spectacular and extraordinary, but at its fundamental level, every single bit of life is just following basic chemical laws. And so, like, there's nothing like, you know, a sandcastle where, like, actually this is having to be continuously propped up on itself, and it could just be a pile. Yeah, all the atoms in your body could just be a pile as well, but it just so happens the way that they're behaving is also quite natural. And so, like, without life continuing to live, you're going to tend towards the pile. But it just so happens you have this really cool, like, self-driving replicating system. So, yeah, it's that it doesn't really go against the second law at all. But also, to build off of a little bit of what Jim said earlier that I think is important, is that in your question, something that you said in there, and this may be redundant, but like what you said in your question is complexity evidence for or against God? I wouldn't argue that it's evidence against God so much. I appreciate what Jim is saying, and I think he's right. But what I would say is that, like, when you're talking about atheism, it's really important to be stressing evidence for, because you can't prove a negative. So saying, like, this proves there is no God, or this is evidence against the idea of a God, I could track with that in the way that Jim was saying it, that, like, you know, if we're actually talking about, like, good design, that doesn't really work. But in terms of just, like, any kind of super intelligent thing making the universe and blah, 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 I just rhetorically try to steer away from that a little bit. But that's just me. And I'm a different person than Jim is. And I liked what Jim said anyway. So I'm just throwing that out there. It's just a thing to think about as well. Just in terms of, like, the actual phrasing of your question.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you mentioned a sandcastle, but then I think that could be also an example, or like a analogy to use for intelligent design. Like, you were talking about pile of sand or sandcastle, and I might be taking what you said out of context a little bit, but change that a little bit. Like, the odds of grains of sand making or forming a sandcastle is much lower than just finding a pile of sand. Just like the people we are.
Yeah, it depends. Right, but so. Right, but we have perfectly natural formations that people claim are built by mankind. There are the steps off of the coast of Japan, the giant steps that people claim were created by somebody. And then there's a wall in Russia that people claim are stones. And when you go and talk to a geologist, they go, no, it's this type of stone, and that's the way these stones weather and form over time. It's just the way they work. And so we see design all the time where there is no design. And when I was going back to design, in order to determine something is designed, you always have to compare it to something you either know is designed or know isn't designed. So if I take a watch and I want to look at a watch and I go, was this watch designed? And I go, oh, look, the metallurgy is not something we normally see in nature. We can assume that it was designed. If we look at a watch and we go, oh, look, there are cogs, and nature doesn't use cogs, therefore it must be designed. And then we go, oh, wait, no, that's not quite true, because the leaf cutter actually uses cogs for its primary means of leaping. So it's not true that cogs aren't there. And it may not be true that you can get brass or other alloys naturally as well, under the right circumstances. But that goes back to being able to compare it to something to the natural world and going, we don't see this, therefore it must be designed. But we can't do that at a universal level. We have no universe to compare to. There's just no way to do it. We'd have to have another universe to compare to in order to make those types of things. We don't know what a designed or undesigned universe looks like. We only have this one to explore.
I think it's also important to point out, like, to kind of build off of what Jim was saying there about the watch and everything like that. Like, I think that what you're, and correct me if I'm wrong here if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, Jim, but, like, it sounded like you were kind of pointing it. It's not just the things that make the thing; it's the things that make the things that make the thing that don't have like a natural, right. And like that. You know, I'm a biologist. I can talk a little bit about planets and galaxies, but, like, mainly, you know, one of the big things that theists ask about is, like, well, where did life come from and all these different things. And that, to build off what Jim was saying, the things that make the life we find naturally, and the things that make life we find naturally as well. So like every part of the universe, from the things that make from quarks all the way up to life. So quarks to protons to atoms to molecules to macromolecules to organelles to cells to tissues to organs to organ systems to organisms, all the way up we find naturally out in the universe, and things that are occurring all on their own without any magic guiding them. So it's not like you see complexity and you're like, okay, well, this is really complicated, therefore there must be somebody behind it. You look a little deeper than that and you say, okay, this is really complicated. What's it made of? What's it doing? How is it doing what it's doing? And no matter where we look when doing that, we never find anything supernatural. We never find anything that isn't self-directed. We never find anything that requires magic to operate. It's all just stuff that the universe does. And that's really freaking cool. And I think it's cooler than saying, there's some guy that did it. You know what I mean? There's just some guy that put this together and made it this way. It's way more interesting and way more exciting to me to be like, yeah, no, this is just the natural way that the universe works. That life is kind of just a thing that can happen. And it's apparently very rare, but it's really, really, really interesting and really beautiful that way. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't resonate with you. What do you think, Caleb?
So when you said like you used the word magic, and you mentioned like the way things work, and you went all the way down to quarks, and then you went all the way back up to life. Like, nobody is denying that. Christians don't deny that. We just think that stuff is too complex to have evolved or come about by a natural process.
Why?
So when you say it's too why is it too complex? Go with that.
Well, because in the atheistic worldview, there was nothing, and that would require
wrong.
To come up.
Absolutely wrong.
Why?
Every time, I'm sorry, I am intentionally cutting you off on this one because no atheist says there was nothing that I'm aware of. In fact, science doesn't say that anything started with nothing. The beginning of the universe, the most popular one is it started with a singularity, which is not nothing. I'm unaware of any hypothesis for the beginning of the universe that starts with nothing. Not only that, just to put the final nail in the coffin, science has proved that nothing cannot exist. They have done several experiments that prove that nothing cannot exist within our universe. So I just want to stop you there. No atheist that I'm aware of says that, and I probably know more than you do. So my anecdotal evidence for that is stronger than yours, and I'm unaware of any survey that would go to prove that. But I hear that, and it really just kind of pisses me off because you're straw manning what the atheist positioned, and you're straw manning it for every atheist. That is just not true. I don't think, I hate to speak to Forrest on anything, but I can safely say, speaking for Forrest, that he also doesn't believe the universe didn't come from nothing.
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah.
Am I too far off base?
No, I think you can say that for me, because like that's the thing is like you can say, like, if we go all the way back to the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, there's a singularity. It expanded. That's why I hate the word Big Bang, because it sounds like there was this explosion in nothing and then the universe happened, and like that's not accurate. It's an everywhere stretch. Everything started stretching, and that's where we got this. But before that, before the Big Bang, where theists use words like nothing, I don't know what that is, and nor does anybody else ever. We don't know what's before the Big Bang, because the question of before the Big Bang doesn't make any sense. The Big Bang is where time started, and it's also where, like, when space began expanding. So you're asking what happened before the concept of before meant anything in a place that was outside of everywhere, like a place that was not anywhere that exists ever. In that place that isn't a place at a time that wasn't time, what happened? And I don't know. We don't know what that means. And so when you talk about an atheistic worldview, we can get into the pedantics of whatever, that's the thing. But like, we're not saying that everything came from nothing. We're saying we have evidence to show that the universe started 13.8 billion years ago, and we can see how that worked pretty well. We know that that's what happened. but we don't know much more than that. We're still learning about it, and we're comfortable with just saying, I don't know about certain things, instead of, again, just saying, well, there was magic, and then now there's all these things. That's a bit too much of a stretch.
So Caleb, can you start your comment again without strawmanning and being scientifically incorrect and saying that anybody says it starts with nothing? Can you rephrase without that particular incorrectness?
I didn't. You said that science has disproved nothing within the universe. Of course, I wasn't saying that there was nothing. I was saying simply no life, nothing that is actually conscious or alive at all.
Okay, yeah,
That
there
would
was a
include
time
God.
before life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what?
Life, yeah.
It would require a biogenesis of some sort to start off this whole evolutionary process that you guys talk about.
Uh-huh.
And most
Absolutely.
there was
Abiogenesis.
there was a time before stars, and then stars happened, and there was a time before planets, and then the first planet formed. There was a time before life, and then the first life got started.
And there's a time before matter.
Yeah, there was exactly. Yeah, and that was the time we don't know that exists. And so like there was a time before everything, supposedly. But like in terms of like everything physical in the universe, yeah, you could point to just about anything and say there was a time before the telephone. So how did people talk? But that's just what happens is that things develop in really cool ways. Are you asking me like, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, and I understand we've cut you off a bit, so forgive me. I'll let you speak now. But like, are you saying that like the fact that life got started is too big of a stretch for you, or are you saying that like that life had to be forever? Like, what are you saying?
I'm just saying that for evolution to start without a creator, that is, then life would have to come from nothing, because you believe that there was a point when there was nothing that was living, right?
No, we don't. You keep using this word nothing, and I would like you to stop.
He did clarify. He said he means life came from non-life. And so it's a
he just
bad
used
word
nothing.
to use.
Yeah, he just used that word again to refer to absolute nothing, which we already know doesn't exist. So, yes, there was a time when life didn't begin. That process is called abiogenesis. It's still under study. I wouldn't say there's a theory there, but there's a ton of good evidence that there's more than one way for it to happen.
Yeah, Caleb, if you'd like, I'm happy to talk about abiogenesis with you and why it's very, very reasonable. Or do you have a different point you're trying to get to? Oh, excuse me, real burpish.
All right, well, what is the evidence for it?
So there's a few things you can think about. Number one, Jim, do you mind if I go on a little tangent?
Absolutely not. I was just getting ready to go catch it, Forrest.
So just there's a few things to think about here. Number one, we mentioned the stuff that makes the stuff that makes stuff. You know what I mean? So I'm not gonna. I'll try to keep the jargon to a minimum as best I can. If I say anything that sounds weird, feel free to stop me, and I'll be happy to clarify. There's four major macromolecules that make life, and those are proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Those are the things that make everything alive, right? Proteins are made of things called amino acids. So that's the stuff that makes the stuff that makes life. Amino acids self-assemble. We've seen this in laboratory settings, and we've also seen this. We just find them in space all the time. Like you go to some asteroid, some comet, we take samples, we find amino acids. And so there's like 500 different kinds of amino acids that we've discovered. You only need 20-ish, around 20, really 20, but like 22-ish. But you only need 20 of them to make life. Like all life on Earth uses about 20 of them. So we can not only make these things in a laboratory, but we also find them in nature all the time. Carbohydrates are made of sugars. We find those in nature all the time as well, and in space we find it. In fact, we found all of these things. What was it? Lipids are made of fatty acids. Guess what we find in space? Lipids are made of a few things. That's the main one. And nucleic acids are made of nitrogenous bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. Those are the things that make DNA and RNA. And guess what? We have found all 5 of those in space too. We find them in meteorites quite frequently. So all of the things that make life, we have found in space, and or we have been able to. Some of them we've been able to make in laboratories here on Earth. So those are the building blocks of life. But Where do they get to the part? Because these are all polymers, right? They can't just be by themselves. Well, it just so happens that I think it was 2 years ago, there was a paper that came out showing that it's peptide elongation, which is the turning amino acids into very simple little mini itty bitty proteins. We call it peptides. And those are developing by themselves on the surface tension of microdroplets of water. And so the leading hypothesis for abiogenesis right now is that life probably started in tide pools. Before that, we were talking about hydrothermal vents, but now a lot more evidence is showing tide pools. And just in time for that, we find, that in the kind of ocean spray that you get out of tide pools, that's where amino acids form proteins by themselves. Nucleic acids forming RNA, that was another big one. And I believe it was I think it was early this year. There was a paper that came out showing oligoribonucleic acids, so very short chunks of RNA, self-assembling in the presence of really basic minerals and shit that we find all over the planet. And we also know that RNA can self-replicate. We've seen that happening in laboratory settings and in the field quite a bit. RNA can produce its own enzyme, can produce enzymes that can help it to self-replicate. RNA works as genetic material and also as a catalyst for lots of other biochemical reactions. You can think about, for example, the central dogma of biology: DNA, RNA to protein, transcription and translation. What does DNA turn it into? It's turned into mRNA, messenger RNA, that codes for a protein. What reads the messenger RNA to build the protein? It's rRNA. It's a ribosome, which is made of ribosomal RNA. Ribosomes are made of RNA. What brings the amino acids over to build the protein? It's transfer RNA, tRNA. So RNA reads RNA and tells RNA to build a protein. It's crazy how many things this molecule does. Don't even start on RNA. I'll be here all day. Long story short, the things that make the things that make life, we've found all of them naturally occurring all over the place. We have seen ways in which they chain together and build themselves all over the place. We still have some hangups in the middle there. We're not sure how all the nuclei or how the amino acids all become left-handed, which that's a whole thing that I can explain, but it'll take 20 minutes. But we don't have an abiotic way to do that in the lab, but we see it happen in nature. So clearly there's a way. And also think about the fact that life, we have evidence of life on this planet, almost immediately after the Hadean period ended. So you have about 1 billion years after the Earth's first form, where the Earth is a molten hellscape, just comets and asteroids all the time, no life happening. The second that stops, we get evidence of life. Evidence of life goes back 3.5 billion years. And so almost as quickly as it was possible for life to start, it started. And that is wild as hell to think about. I could go on this tangent for a long time. And there's a lot more to it. I would encourage everybody listening to check out NASA's astrobiology primer. You can look it up for free online. They're on, I think, version 2. I actually know a friend who's she's an astrobiologist. Who's working. She's an undergraduate fellow, and she's working with them on writing another one pretty soon. But that'll tell you all sorts of stuff about how stars form, how planets form, where life comes from, everything that we know about it. The NASA Astrobiology Primer is a great read. It's pretty short. It's only a couple hundred pages long. So I would encourage everybody to look that up. I would encourage Kaler to look that up too, but he already hung up a long time ago. As soon as I said amino acids, he hung up. I don't think he wanted an answer. Just what I would encourage any theist listening that thinks that life starting is too fantastic is just to remember that the stuff that makes the stuff that makes life self-assembles all the time. And then the stuff that those things make self-assemble, and we've seen it happening. And if you get some RNA, which we know can self-replicate, to bump into some lipids are fats, and go pour some oil into water, it naturally forms little bubbles exactly like the cell membranes that wrap up every single one of your cells. It naturally forms that shape. If you have phospholipids like your cell membranes are, they naturally form bilayers, which is what your cell membranes are, as a phospholipid bilayer. If you get these naturally assembling molecules that are behaving in a natural way to bump into each other, you have something very much like a first cell. And it's stuff, all of it is stuff you can do in a jar. So it's really not that far-fetched. We haven't seen every single step of the way of it. And if you were to boil the whole thing down to like 10 rhetorical steps, we have steps 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, and 9. And there's a lot of theists out there that like to say, well, you don't have step 4, so you don't know anything. And that's simply not how science works. And that's simply not how thinking works. So look up abiogenesis and look up the National Astrobiology Primer and learn some cool shit about some cool shit, because I'm telling you, it is worth your time to do so.